Welcome to Occult Archives. You know, the place we go to dig up the myths and legends behind history's most infamous books.
Not just any books. We're talking about the ones they say hold secrets too dangerous to even read aloud. Grimoires and the like.
Right, like hidden away for a reason.
Exactly.
And this time we're taking you deep into a world of alchemists. Episode 260, Lives of Alchemistical Philosophers. Forbidden experiments, hidden adepts, and the occult legacy of the magnum opus.
So we're talking about the people behind the books, right? The folks who devoted their lives to cracking the secrets of the universe, transmutation, the elixir of life, all that.
And for this deep dive, we're using Arthur Edward Waite's Lives of Alchemistical Philosophers from 1888.
It's interesting, though. It's not entirely original, you know?
Oh, right. He based it on an earlier work.
Yeah. From 1815, anonymous.
Ah, so he kind of expanded on it.
He basically took it apart and put it back together. Added a ton of his own research, his own insights, more biographies, discussion of the magnum opus.
The magnum opus, that's like the ultimate goal of alchemy, right? Creating the Philosopher's Stone.
Exactly. And he expanded the catalog of Hermetic philosophy works, too. It's really comprehensive.
I like how he even corrects some mistakes from the original Rite in the preface, like the birth year of Irenaeus Philalethes.
He's very particular about getting things right, even with a subject as slippery as alchemy.
Well, good, because today we're going to try and do the same. Unpack some of the most intriguing stories from Waite's book about these alchemists. What made them tick? What did they believe?
Yeah. And what does their quest for knowledge, and maybe even a bit of forbidden power, tell us about ourselves?
Right, so who better to start with than someone who straddled the line between power and secrets? Avicenna?
Avicenna, or Evansina, a brilliant mind, born around the year 1000 in Khorasan. And what's amazing is this guy was a polymath. Not just an alchemist, but a doctor, a philosopher. You name it, he mastered it.
I read he was a prodigy, mastering math and transcendental philosophy as a teenager, then moving on to medicine.
And get this, there's a story about him diagnosing the king of Gordia's nephew. The guy was sick, nobody knew why. Turns out it was all because of a secret love affair.
Wow. Talk about a keen observer of human nature. I bet that helped him with his alchemy, too.
For sure. To see the hidden connections, the subtle influences.
But it's funny, right? This guy was also Grand Vizier, top political position.
And then he, they say he liked to party a little too much.
And ended up dying in obscurity at 56.
Yeah. Bit of a fall from grace. But even after his death, the legends persisted.
Like what?
Oh, the Arabs believed he could control spirits, the jinn. And there were whispers that he didn't actually die, just retreated to a hidden place to live forever.
So his knowledge became this kind of legend.
Exactly. Larger than life.
Though Waite does say a lot of the Hermetic texts attributed to Avicenna probably aren't actually his.
Right. But there are a few that are considered genuine, like Congelation of the Stone and Tractatus de Alchemia.
And those give us some clues about his alchemical theories.
The Tractatus Alchemy is particularly interesting. It talks about Sophic mercury and sulfur being the root of all minerals.
Sophic mercury, that's
It's this universal life-giving spirit, the grand elixir that can perfect any substance.
That sounds like a pretty important concept.
It is. It's central to alchemical thinking, this idea that there's this force that can penetrate and purify matter, making it perfect.
So even though Avicenna built on the work of earlier alchemists, he still had some unique ideas.
Definitely. And he was also very practical. He documented a lot of information about substances like saltpeter, common salt, vitriol, and sal ammoniac. He was working with the raw materials of alchemy,
Now let's shift gears a bit. Talk about a different kind of alchemist. Maureen, the hermit of Jerusalem.
Maureen is like the opposite of Avicenna. He's all about renouncing the material world to find spiritual wisdom. Born in Rome in the 12th century, he went to Egypt to learn about science and became obsessed with the writings of this Arabian philosopher, Adfar of Alexandria.
So obsessed that he left his home to become Adfar's student.
Yeah. He wanted to unlock the secrets hidden in those texts.
What kind of secrets were so powerful that someone would just up and leave their life behind?
Well, eventually, Adfar did share his secrets with Maureen. It shows how important mentorship was in alchemy.
Yeah.
This idea of passing down knowledge directly.
And then Maureen went on to become a hermit and teach his own student.
Exactly. Like a lineage of hidden knowledge.
But then the story takes a wild turn, right? When Adfar's manuscripts, the ones containing the secret of the Philosopher's Stone, end up in the hands of Khalid, the Sultan of Egypt.
And Khalid couldn't figure them out, so he gathered all these philosophers in Cairo to try and decipher them.
Imagine that scene, a room full of scholars trying to crack the code of immortality.
And Morian shows up and actually does it. He creates the elixir for Khalid and leaves this cryptic message on it.
What was it? Something like,
He who possesses all has no need of others.
oh, that's so cryptic. It's like he's saying worldly power doesn't matter anymore once you have the ultimate knowledge.
Right. Like he's reached a level of self-sufficiency that transcends earthly concerns.
But Khalid doesn't quite get it, does he? He gets frustrated with all the fake alchemists out there.
It was a real problem, trying to separate the genuine seekers from the con artists.
It took a slave named Galip to lead Khalid to Morian in Jerusalem.
Yeah. And then things get even more complex. Because when Morian returns to Khalid, he tries to convert him to Christianity.
So it wasn't just about science or philosophy for him. There was a spiritual element, too.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that their conversations were in Arabic, which were later translated into Latin and French. Shows how these ideas were traveling across cultures.
Waite isn't sure about the authenticity of the three works attributed to Morian, but one of them, the Liber de Compositione Alchemia, is interesting because it talks about Hermes Trismegistus being the first to discover the magnum opus.
And it says the prima materia, that fundamental substance of alchemy, is just one thing. It all goes back to this idea of unity and simplicity.
Okay, let's move on to a figure who was both a brilliant scholar and rumored to be a magician, Albertus Magnus.
Albertus Magnus is a bit of a puzzle because he was undeniably brilliant. But there are these persistent stories about him dabbling in magic.
I mean, even back in 1480, they were calling him Magnus in Magia, great in magic.
Right. But he also explicitly spoke out against the idea of demons revealing the future.
And a lot of magical texts were wrongly attributed to him.
Exactly. So it's a mixed bag.
But Waite points out that even in his accepted works, you can see hints of alchemical knowledge.
And in the Secretum Secretorum, there are descriptions of specific experiments that sound very alchemical.
Plus, there are those amazing stories told by folks like Michael Mayer.
Like the one where Albertus received the secret of the Philosopher's Stone from his students.
Or the one about him having a stone marked with a serpent that had all kinds of powers.
And let's not forget the talking automaton he built. The one that Thomas Aquinas supposedly destroyed because it was so creepy.
Wow, a talking automaton, like an early robot.
Right. Whether those stories are literally true or symbolic, they definitely add to his mystique.
And then there's that story about the winter supper he held for William II in Cologne, where he supposedly made summer flowers bloom in the middle of winter.
Sounds almost miraculous.
It does. So even though his main focus was theology and philosophy, he clearly had some connection to Hermetic science.
It shows how those boundaries were really fluid back then.
Okay, let's tackle the next enigma, Raymond Lully.
Now, with Lully, it's really hard to say what's real and what's legend. There are so many writings attributed to him, but scholars can't agree on which ones are genuine.
Especially the ones about alchemy.
Exactly. So the big question is, was this Lully, the famous philosopher and theologian, also the alchemist who made gold for the King of England?
Some folks, like Eliphas Levi, definitely thought so.
But there are some big problems with that theory. For one thing, Lully was a big advocate for poverty. It doesn't really fit with him making gold for a king.
And he publicly criticized the idea of the Philosopher's Stone.
Plus, one of the alchemical works attributed to him mentions Edward III, who lived after Lully died.
So maybe it was a different Raymond.
There's another guy, Raymond of Farrago, who might be the real alchemist.
But there's still that incredible story of Lully going to Vienna, getting invited to England and Scotland, making the rose nobles for King Edward in Westminster Abbey.
It's a great story, but the main source for it, the Cremer Testament, is a fake.
There was no Abbot John Cremer at Westminster during that time.
Nope.
So those coins probably weren't made by alchemy at all.
Probably not. And even Lully himself said in one of his books that one metal can't be changed into another. He thought alchemical gold was just a clever imitation.
Okay, so maybe the whole Lully as alchemist thing is more myth than reality.
Maybe. But there is one text, the Clavicula, or Little Key, that's generally considered to be his.
And it's a guide to making the Philosopher's Stone.
It focuses on reducing gold and silver to their purest essence, something called Sophic Argent Vive.
So even if we're not sure about Lully himself, this text gives us a glimpse into the practical side of alchemy.
And whoever wrote under his name definitely knew a lot about chemicals, like nitric acid and spirit of wine.
All right, next up, Arnold de Villanova, a doctor and an alchemist.
Another one with a bit of a hazy history. We're not even sure where or when he was born exactly.
But we know he studied medicine all over Europe, in Paris, Italy.
And he was a physician to important figures like Frederick of Naples and Sicily.
And of course, there were rumors about him practicing magic.
Like that time he supposedly tried to create an artificial human.
Sounds far-fetched, but then again, so does a lot of this stuff.
True, but he did have defenders back then.
And if he really was a magician, would Pope Clement V have chosen him as his personal doctor?
Probably not.
The books of his that were condemned for heresy, not magic.
Right. And according to John Andre, a contemporary of his, Arnold actually succeeded in making gold.
So he was a genuine alchemist.
Seems like it.
Waite also mentions that Arnold's writing was unusually clear for an alchemist.
Yeah. He was known for getting straight to the point, which probably helped spread his ideas.
His alchemical works were published in 1509, and some of his most famous treatises include the Thesaurus Thesaurum and the Rosarium Philosophorum.
His theories were really important for later alchemists. He believed that mercury was the key to perfecting metals, and that sulfur was what caused their imperfections.
So you had to purify the metals, remove the impurities to get to their true essence.
Exactly. And he also believed that the Philosopher's Stone already existed in nature. You just had to know how to extract it.
Fascinating. All right, let's talk about Jean de Meung now. A poet, but also an alchemist.
That's right. He's most famous for his continuation of the Roman de la Rose, a long poem from the 13th century.
But alchemists saw that poem as an allegory for the secrets of the magnum opus.
Yeah, they thought it was full of hidden meanings about transmutation and the Philosopher's Stone.
That's wild, like a secret code hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And aside from the poem, he also wrote some alchemical works directly, like Nature's Remonstrances to the Alchemist and The Alchemist's Answer to Nature.
I read that the sermon given by Genius in the Roman de la Rose was seen as a kind of secret lesson in chemistry.
And some verses in the poem were believed to contain actual chemical information.
So he was definitely more than just a casual dabbler in alchemy.
There's also this great story about his will, where he left a big chest to the Jacobin monks, and everyone thought it was full of gold.
But it wasn't.
Nope. Turns out it was full of engraved slates.
Oh, what a letdown for those monks.
Right. But it shows how people really believed in his alchemical powers, even if the story is probably just a legend.
And those other writings of his, Nature's Remonstrance and The Alchemist's Answer, they give us a peek into the debates going on within the alchemical community.
The first one criticizes those who relied on simple techniques, while the second is all about regretting being misled by the confusing language of other alchemists.
It's like they were always trying to figure out who was genuine and who was a fake.
Always searching for the real knowledge.
Okay, let's move on to a figure who held a lot of power. Pope John XXII. Was he really an alchemist?
That's the big question, right? His official biographers say no, but there's some intriguing evidence.
Like what?
Well, he believed in magic, for one thing. He even accused the Bishop of Cahors of practicing it.
And he was a contemporary of Lully and Villanova, even supposedly friends with Villanova.
Right, and even though he issued a papal bull against fake alchemists, some Hermetic writers say he wasn't condemning true adepts.
Maybe he was trying to distance himself from the less reputable ones.
Could be. And there are reports that he had his own laboratory in Avignon.
Plus, there's that reference from Franciscus Paggi saying that John XXII wrote about transmutation.
The wording is a bit vague, but it's definitely suggestive.
And then there's the vast wealth they found after he died. Millions in gold and jewels.
Some people claimed he made it all through alchemy. There's even a story about him creating 200 gold bars.
200?
Yeah. And there's a treatise attributed to him, the Elixir of the Philosophers, which might have been deliberately misleading.
Misleading? Why?
He was written for the clergy, maybe to give them some basic alchemical principles without revealing the real secrets.
Oh, like a decoy.
Exactly. And the ingredients he mentions are pretty weird. Vinegar, salt, urine, even sulfur vive. Not your typical alchemical recipe.
Okay, now for a real legend. Nicholas Flamel.
Flamel is a fascinating case. Unlike most alchemists, he's remembered for his success and his good fortune.
And his charitable works, right?
Exactly. He was practically a saint in alchemical circles.
Of course, there's the famous story of the angel appearing to him in a dream and giving him the book by Abraham the Jew.
The book that supposedly held the key to the Philosopher's Stone.
But he still had to study it for years before he figured it out.
Yeah. It wasn't just handed to him.
Scholars don't really believe the alchemical writings attributed to him are authentic, though. They say they appeared too late.
But there's one, the Trésor de Philosophie, that might be genuine. There's an early manuscript of it in the Bibliothèque du Roi.
So maybe there's some truth to the legend after all.
Maybe. Some critics, like Louis Figuier, said that Flamel's wealth just came from being a good businessman and living frugally.
But they also acknowledge that he was interested in alchemy.
And then there's that crazy story of the traveler who claimed to have met Flamel and his wife centuries after they supposedly died.
Like they faked their deaths and went into hiding.
Right. It's like their legend just refused to die.
According to the Trésor de Philosophie, the prima materia is prepared mercury, and the first step in transmutation is reducing metals back to their mercurial essence.
It's all about getting back to the fundamental building blocks of matter.
Okay, next up. Basil Valentine, a mysterious figure.
This is another one where we're not even sure if he was a real person. There's so many conflicting stories about his life.
And then there's that legend of his writings being discovered in a pillar after a lightning strike.
It's like he was touched by divine inspiration.
He's credited with introducing antimony into medicine, but that story about how it got its name, anti-monk, because it poisons some monks, is probably not true.
Right. But he did see antimony as a powerful medicine, but only for those who understood its alchemical properties.
So it was dangerous in the wrong hands.
Very much so. He believed in the power of ancient knowledge, but also the responsibility that came with it.
He wrote a lot of alchemical works, but most of them haven't been translated from their original German.
Some of the key ones are De Microcosmo, Azoth, Practica, the Apocalypsis Chymica, the Triumphal Chariot of Antimony, and Heligraphia.
The Triumphal Chariot of Antimony. That sounds epic.
It is. Waite says every detail in that book is significant.
Oh, and there's a poem attributed to Basil Valentine that describes the Philosopher's Stone in very strange terms.
White and red, both a stone and not a stone.
Very mysterious. It's like they're trying to describe something that's beyond our normal understanding.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to a real die-hard alchemist,
Yeah.
Bernard Trevisan.
This guy dedicated his entire life to alchemy. Started experimenting at 14 and kept going for decades.
Talk about dedication.
He was born in 1406 to a wealthy family in Padua, so he had the resources to pursue his passion.
But he spent a fortune on his experiments.
He said he spent about 6,000 crowns in the first 15 years alone, and all for nothing.
What kind of things did he try?
Everything you can imagine. Different plants, minerals, even animal dung. He followed the recipes of other alchemists, but nothing worked.
At one point, he even turned to prayer, asking for guidance.
It's like he was getting desperate.
He tried working with sea salt, rectified it over and over again for 18 months. Still nothing.
Then he partnered with a magistrate to try dissolving silver and mercury. That lasted 5 years, and still no philosopher's stone.
5 years.
He was incredibly persistent. But after all those failures, he decided to travel and find a real adept, someone who could teach him the secrets.
And that's how he met Maître Geoffroy de la Maurier.
Right. They worked together for 8 years, trying to extract the stone from hen's eggs.
8 years with eggs? That's dedication.
He even tried working with a proto-notary in Bruges, using sulfate of iron, but that made him really sick.
What?
He was bedridden for 14 months.
Wow.
But he still didn't give up. He went to Germany and met with Maître Henry, the same guy who later worked with Denis Ecker.
And they tried making the stone using mercury, silver, olive oil, and sulfur.
Yeah. And surprise, surprise, it didn't work.
So after all that, after spending a fortune and traveling all over Europe, he finally gave up.
He did. For a while, at least.
But of course, the alchemical bug bit him again.
It's hard to shake that obsession once it takes hold.
So he traveled even further to the east, still searching for that elusive secret.
And in the end, he retreated to Rhodes, defeated, but still fascinated by alchemy.
What a story. Now let's talk about a slightly more successful English alchemist, Sir George Ripley.
Ripley was a canon, a member of the clergy, but also a serious alchemist. He started out in the Bridlington Priory, but he quickly realized that books weren't enough.
So he set off on his own alchemical journey.
Exactly. Traveled all over Italy, Germany, France. He even claimed to have seen a transmutation in Rome.
Really? So he'd actually witnessed it.
That's what he said. And there's a story about him donating a large sum of money to the Knights of St. John in Rhodes.
Sounds like he might have actually made some gold.
Maybe. He did achieve some fame in his lifetime, even received honors from the Pope.
But it seems like that led to some jealousy within his order.
Yeah, he ended up transferring to the Carmelite order and lived a more solitary life after that.
And that's when he wrote his books.
Most of them, yeah. He wrote 24 in total, including his most famous one, The 12 Gates of Alchemy.
I like that he included a disclaimer in his writings, saying that it took him 20 years to really master the art.
He wanted people to know it wasn't something you could learn overnight.
He died in 1490. What does the 12 Gates of Alchemy tell us about his theories?
Well, it describes the Philosopher's Stone as a microcosm of the universe. He was very into the idea of proportion and harmony.
So alchemy was more than just a physical process for him.
Definitely. He saw it as a spiritual pursuit, a way to understand the deeper workings of the cosmos.
Okay, on to Paracelsus. A bit of a rebel, wasn't he?
Paracelsus. What a name. His real name was even longer. Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombast von Hohenheim.
That's a mouthful.
Right. Born in Switzerland in 1493. His father was a doctor. His mother worked in a hospital. So he was practically born into the medical world.
But he didn't exactly follow the traditional path, did he?
No, not at all. He studied alchemy and surgery along with traditional medicine, and he was very critical of the old authorities.
He even burned Galen's books in public, didn't he?
Yeah, that was a pretty bold statement.
Talk about rejecting the status quo.
He was a big believer in the three principles: salt, mercury, and sulfur. He thought they were the foundation of all matter.
And he traveled all over, right? Even got captured by Tartars at one point.
There are all kinds of crazy stories about his travels. Some people say he even went to Constantinople and learned the secret of the universal solvent from an Arabian alchemist.
Universal solvent.
The azoth, or alkahest, a substance that could dissolve anything.
Wow.
When he got back to Europe, he became an army surgeon for a while, and then he was invited to teach at the University of Basel.
And that's where he really started shaking things up.
Oh, yeah. His lectures are legendary. He argued with everyone, challenged all the accepted medical knowledge.
But his treatments were effective, weren't they?
Yeah, he had a lot of success using minerals in his medicine.
But he also had a knack for stirring up controversy.
Like that time, he used excrement in a lecture to make a point.
Okay, that's a bit much.
Yeah, the authorities weren't too happy about that one. He ended up having to leave Basel.
So he went back to wandering and practicing medicine on his own terms.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to Denis Zachaire. His story is a bit more personal, isn't it?
Yeah, we don't even know his real name. He wrote under the pseudonym Denis Zachaire.
And his book, The Opusculum Gymicum, is all about his own experiences with alchemy.
Exactly. It's like a first-hand account of his journey, his successes and failures.
So he was born in Guyenne in 1510, a nobleman, and he got into alchemy through his tutor while studying in Bordeaux.
They were supposed to be studying law, but they got so obsessed with alchemy that they gave up everything else.
And they blew through all their money on experiments.
Pretty much.
And then his tutor died from furnace fever.
It's a reminder of how dangerous this work could be.
So Denis went back home, but he didn't give up on alchemy.
Nope. He sold off more of his family's property to fund an Italian alchemist in Toulouse.
But that didn't work out either.
The Italian took the money and ran.
Oh, no.
So Denis went back to experimenting on his own, met an old guy who called himself the Philosopher.
Well, of course he did.
And had another string of failures. Then he teamed up with an abbé. They tried a Roman process, spent a whole year distilling things day after day.
And Denis got sick again.
This time with a terrible fever.
It's like the universe was trying to tell him to quit.
He did hear about Maitre Henry, the German emperor's confessor, supposedly having the Philosopher's Stone.
The same Maitre Henry who worked with Bernard Trevisan.
The very same. So Denis went to Germany, gave him what little money he had left for one last experiment.
And it failed.
Of course.
So at that point, he must have been completely disillusioned.
He was. Even his family told him to give up alchemy for good.
And he did.
For a while.
Yeah.
But then he relapsed and went back to his travels.
But this time, something was different.
In his book, he claims that he finally succeeded.
He actually made the Philosopher's Stone.
That's what he said. He was so grateful that he gave away most of his wealth and went to live a quiet life in Switzerland.
Wow. What a journey. Okay, let's talk about Thomas Charnock. He was a self-taught alchemist, right?
That's right. He was born in 1524 on the Isle of Thanet. He called himself unlettered, but he was clearly a bright guy. He loved astronomy and philosophy, and he worked as a surgeon near Salisbury.
So he had a good mix of practical and intellectual skills.
Definitely. And he learned alchemy from two interesting sources. The first was Sir James S., a priest who claimed to have mastered alchemy through meditation.
Through meditation. That's an unusual approach.
It is. And the second was a blind man named William Byrd, a former prior of Bath.
A blind alchemist.
Yeah, it's a strange story. Charnock met him at an inn, and they somehow recognized each other as fellow seekers of alchemical knowledge.
Some kind of sixth sense.
Maybe, but Byrd was very reluctant to share his secrets. He made Charnock swear an oath of secrecy and promised to reveal them only at the end of his life.
Wow, that's serious.
Byrd called his knowledge the mystery of mineral prudence, and they spent 9 days together talking about alchemy.
So what was Byrd's story?
Well, he said he'd used his alchemical knowledge to repair Bath Abbey. But after the abbey was suppressed, the transmuting powder he'd been using disappeared.
And that's what made him blind.
That's what he believed. He said he'd gotten the knowledge from a servant of George Ripley, so there's another connection to our earlier figures.
So Charnock had two masters, both with their own unique approaches to alchemy.
Right. And after his first master died, he inherited his alchemical work. But things didn't go smoothly for Charnock.
What happened?
Well, he had trouble with his furnace, and on New Year's Day in 1555, his whole lab burned down.
Oh.
He had to start all over again, and this time he hired a servant to help him.
But that turned out to be a bad idea.
Yeah. The servant messed things up, and Charnock's second attempt at making the stone failed.
It's a reminder of how delicate this work was, how much could go wrong.
And how important secrecy was.
Okay, let's move on to a more notorious pair, John Dee and Edward Kelly.
Now, these two are a fascinating combination. Dee was a brilliant scholar, a mathematician and philosopher, very interested in the occult.
And Kelly was the alchemist.
Exactly. He claimed to have the Philosopher's Stone, or at least a red powder that could transmute metals.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is. And they traveled all over Europe together, performing experiments and trying to prove their abilities.
They even went to Prague and worked for Emperor Rudolph II, right?
Yeah, they were quite famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask.
But there were always doubts about Kelly's abilities, weren't there?
Always. People accused him of being a fraud.
And he ended up being imprisoned by Rudolph.
That's right.
What about Dee? What happened to him?
He went back to England, worked for Queen Elizabeth for a while, but he ended up in financial trouble later on.
So, not so successful in the end.
Not really. And Kelly tried to escape from prison, but he died in the attempt.
So it seems like their partnership wasn't so lucky after all.
Not for them, at least. But Kelly did write a treatise on the Philosopher's Stone while he was in prison.
Interesting. And Dee kept a diary, right?
Yes, a very detailed one, which has since been published. It gives us a lot of insight into their work together.
Dee's son claimed that he'd actually witnessed Kelly performing successful transmutations.
That's a pretty strong statement. And there's a poem in the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum that makes fun of alchemists who stuck to the old ways, which might be a reference to Kelly's supposedly more advanced methods.
Fascinating. Okay, on to a more mystical figure, Jacob Boehme.
Boehme was a different kind of alchemist. He was more of a mystic, a spiritual seeker. He was a shoemaker from Görlitz, and he had all these visions that led him to write about theology and philosophy.
He wasn't really interested in making gold, was he?
Not in the literal sense.
Yeah.
His works are more about spiritual transformation, about understanding the hidden forces of the universe.